All right, so just an update on the Jacksonville Stadium situation. They come out with the big renderings. The original thought is it's going to be around $1 billion. That was kind of the estimate, possibly 2025, 2026. Well, there was a big article that says Jaguars plan to meet with Daytona International Speedway officials in the coming weeks about the possibility of using the racetrack as a temporary home for the stadium for 2 years. The renovation likely going to cost 2 years, and it is apparently going to be a pretty hefty price tag with the current inflation that's going on in the country. They're estimating right now the stadium itself is going to be $1.3 to $1.4 billion. That's for, I really wouldn't consider this a renovation. I would probably say this is a rebuild if it's going to cost $1.3 or $1.4 billion. And they're saying the surrounding area altogether could exceed $2 billion for this stadium rebuild. It is remarkable considering we've seen super stadiums like US Bank Stadium cost right around $1 billion. This is a rebuild that's costing this much. And yeah, inflation is completely out of control. I agree with that. But the funding for this, we've heard time and time again, 5-6 years ago, the Jaguars playing all these games in London. Now they have 2 games in London. Everyone's saying they're going to move there. I always thought it was never going to happen because the travel would be so ridiculous, and I still don't think it's going to happen, but there is a big incentive to get this done. The funding is going to be a problem if it is around $2 billion. How much of it is public funding? The stadium is owned by the city of Jacksonville, but I do believe it will be partially privately funded, but that is a very, very hefty price tag for it. Originally, project officials felt it would be much less expensive to renovate. 6 months later, price escalation pushed well beyond the $1 billion, sources said were initial estimates from the site. The total makeover of TIAA Bank Field with a roof canopy is projected to cost right around $1.4 billion, hiked up by inflation. The best case scenario, pending a deal with the city, would be to start the construction after the 2025 season, with the team playing 2 years at a temporary location before returning to TIAA Bank Field for the 2028 season. So they've even pushed that back a year now, and they're saying the construction would start after 2025. So they would still be at the unrenovated stadium for 3 more years, and then the construction starts. And then when it comes to where they'll play at, the closest stadiums, referencing Ben Hill Griffin Stadium, which I think is dumb. It would just come off looking really weird if they played at a college stadium. I still think the most realistic scenario for them in a temporary relocation is Camping World Stadium. It would come off as a much more neutral site, and I know Orlando really wants that to happen, even though it would be temporarily. They would get a really good Jacksonville team in Trevor Lawrence's prime years, assuming he resigns with a big contract there in the future. I went down a little bit of a rabbit hole on the Camping World Stadium. It did receive a huge renovation in 2014, but they are looking for a bunch more money to renovate the upper deck because apparently the upper deck is like really old seating and it's just not in good shape. It looks like bleacher seating in the upper deck, which would be kind of a big no-no when it comes to like an NFL team playing there. So if we're talking about 3 years or 4 years from now, the Jaguars having to play at a different stadium, a renovation could be pushed on Camping World to bring it up to standard for an NFL facility. And again, it just makes the most sense in terms of it really being a neutral site. It would be very tough for Jacksonville fans because I know they want to keep that team in the city because they should be pretty good at that time in like 2026, 2027. And maybe they're so desperate they try and do a crazy thing with like a minor league stadium that we'll talk about in a second. But right now, I would still say Camping World Stadium, if they get an upper deck renovation and the seats become better, that is where it could go. Camping World Stadiums, does not have a regular tenant outside of a bowl game. And so they host like soccer events, concerts. They want this big renovation now to be able to host premier like concerts and events and things like that. There could also be a temporary solution in Jacksonville, adding seats to the city's minor league baseball stadium or the track stadium at the University of North Florida. Both options come with a big retrofit that would cost over $100 million. So, yeah, I mean, I've seen the North Florida Stadium. There's no way. It's just not. They would have to do a bunch to that. And then a local report mentioned Daytona International Speedway as an option with a capacity over 100,000. The racetrack may seem far-fetched for an NFL football team, but they did not dismiss the opportunity. They plan to meet with track officials over the next few weeks to discuss it. It would be an interesting solution, but it would also require significant investment in terms of infrastructure. It can accommodate a big crowd. It would be a little wonky, but it's worth considering. So Daytona possibly, we've seen some games be played at those race tracks and speedways. It's pretty remarkable stuff. I don't think that's going to happen. It still seems like the far and away easiest solution for this problem is just putting them at Camping World Stadium in Orlando, but we'll have to see what ends up happening. This, I'm a little skeptical on this project, but the one thing the city of Jacksonville, they know they need to get this done because there's been so much talk about them moving. They have a terrible stadium. They have to get it done, but with it costing almost $2 billion total, that is not a great sign. And then this is just something I found interesting in relation to Jacksonville. This is another firm with a renovation study for a $1 billion stadium rebuild to the Jaguars stadium in 2022. This was talked about, and it's a very similar design, but a much more open look. And I will say, if you actually zoom that in, that's a very interesting setup. You have a big pool on the bottom and then two pools on the side with a bunch of greenery. I gotta be honest, I really like that setup. And then it looks like there's a restaurant on the bottom. And then you also do have seating right beside the scoreboard on each side. So this, they're not going with this design. They're doing, the one that they showed, but I'll tell you, that looks pretty nice. You know what it reminds me of? The Intuit Dome a little bit. It's not fully enclosed and it's a lot more open. I think part of the reason they didn't go with this one is probably because they want a more controlled environment. I mean, technically the design that they're going with is open air, but it's the SoFi design. So you've got the roof, it's fixed. I consider it a fixed dome, even though there is airflow that gets let into it. This is a much more open design. I'm not sure if it would be retractable or not. I would assume not. So this is a design where it's not retractable. It's like a European soccer stadium. It's just a massive overhang canopy that covers all the fans. And I do think, maybe the humidity, the heat is part of the reason why they didn't go with this. But I will say that pool design was very impressive to me. And this type of setup really makes the pool significant and it signifies it as the key feature in the stadium, which I really, really like. So that's just the design they didn't go with. That looks completely different. I do think it will be resolved, but that is a brutal price estimate for a rebuild. You're talking about the stadium costing 1.4 billion, and then the surrounding area, combined it all together, it's just under $2 billion, and it's now been pushed back possibly a year to where the construction will happen in 2026 and 2027 with the stadium opening in 2028. The Cleveland Browns have a potential rebuild that they're factoring in, possibly renovating the entire lakefront area in and around Cleveland Browns Stadium. They've set that at around $1 billion. I wonder if that's going to get hiked up at all. I would imagine it will with the inflation problems because the Browns are going to do a lot to that surrounding area. And then the Carolina Panthers, we're talking about a $1.2 billion rebuild or renovation to their stadium. They desperately need it as well. So I think you're going to see a lot of these stadiums cost more and more money. I mean, you have the Tennessee Titans fixed roof costing $2.2 billion. The Buffalo Bills just broke ground on their new stadium. It's an open air canopy design at around $1.54 billion. Of course, where you're building these also factors into the cost. They're building it in Buffalo, New York. That's going to be a little bit cheaper than in some other places. So either way, Jacksonville really looking to kickstart this, exploring options. Where will they play? I still think it's going to be Camping World Stadium, but they're talking about maybe a minor league stadium. I know they've said they want to stay in Jacksonville. And, you know, depending on what time they have to leave, it could be tough, but it's looking like for the next few years, the Jaguars should be really good and they should still be in the city. The problem becomes, you know, when they move, you're looking at possibly a really good team not being able to play in their city, and Orlando is far away, you know, so that could complicate things. But either way, I would expect this to get done eventually, but it's probably going to get pretty ugly, kind of similar to the A's moving situation that is right now. There's going to be a lot of bumps along how this is going to be financed, especially if you're talking about a rebuild for $2 billion. But either way, guys, that is going to do it for this video. Make sure you're following me on Twitter. A link to that's always in the description. I'm, of course, the Depressed Ginger. Thank you for